Ladies and gentlemen, it's a tremendous pleasure to see such a wonderful turnout of the members and guests of the Council. And I know it's in large measure due to the efforts of not only Frank Byrd, but various officers of the organization, and their complete desire to really learn something about China from a person who will, I'm sure, give us a most educational picture. Very briefly, Professor Reardon-Anderson, PhD, is professor of the School of Foreign Service and director of Asian Studies at Georgetown University. He has a fantastic background at a very youthful age, which includes his degrees from Williams, where he was Phi Beta Kappa, both at Columbia, a master's degree and a PhD, and numerous academic appointments covering sessions at the Hopkins and Michigan University and the Chinese University in Hong Kong. And in addition to this, he has served as director of the National Academy of Sciences Council on Scholarly Communication with the Peoples of the Republic of China, which is a joint effort between the Chinese, the Americans, and other nationalities. Last but not least, he's a distinguished author, subject of pollution and foreign investment in Taiwan, the study of change, quote, chemistry in China, a very erudite book on Yan'an and the Great Powers, the origins of Chinese Communist foreign policy, 44 to 46. At the present, his current research involves a long-term project among U.S., Chinese, and Mongolian scholars on the human and natural impacts of the grassland ecosystem of the Mongolian steppes. That's a pretty tall order. It is with really tremendous pleasure that I introduce to you all and commend him James B. Reardon-Anderson, PhD, our honored guest tonight, who will just give us a chance to really learn the latest things that's going on in China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, Dr. Byrd. Ladies and gentlemen, probably some of you, if you're interested enough in China to turn out this evening, might have spent some time in front of the television last evening seeing the documentary on the 7th anniversary of the Tiananmen affair. And you were reminded by that event that something seems to be wrong with China. And it wasn't only yesterday that you thought that, because yesterday you were focused on the human rights issue, and you remembered that there were political prisoners in China, and there were forced abortions in China, and there were orphanages allegedly abusing orphans in China, and you kind of got worked up about the state of the treatment of human beings in China. But the day before that, you were reading the Washington Post, and it was a whole different set of problems with China. It was trade problems. It was economic problems. They were somehow undermining our intellectual property rights by pirating software and video and audio discs, or they were demanding entrance into the World Trade Organization when their own economic policies did not qualify them for that. or they were exploiting this huge trade imbalance with the United States. And on that day you thought, well, the problem with these guys is trade and economics. But the day before that, you were watching the news and you noticed that they were selling ring magnets to Pakistan to produce nuclear weapons, and they were exporting missile technology to Iraq and Iran, or they were selling small arms, automatic rifles to dealers in California. And you thought, doggone it, the problem is not human rights or trade, the problem is arms sales and nuclear proliferation. And that's the trouble with China. But the day before that, you recalled that the problem really wasn't any of the above. It was that those guys were launching missiles off the coast of Taiwan, and there was actually a palpable, concrete security threat to the international order from China. Well, it seems like everywhere you look these days, whether it's at human rights or trade or arms sales and nuclear proliferation or strategic concerns in the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea, that the news is bad. And I'll tell you something. If you were reading the newspaper in China, you'd be hearing that the news was bad too, but the problem was America. And the two parties are now locked in this constant battle over one day this issue, the next day that issue, but the relationship seems to be poison, seems to be an unending series of conflicts and disputes across a wide range of issues. And the question is, why is that so? And where is it leading us? Is it that the relationship is now locked in a downward spiral that will lead us to eventually to open confrontation and possibly even renewed warfare? For I remind you that, after all, we have fought the People's Republic of China in Korea. Presumably we could fight them again. Is that the direction we're heading? Or are we going to solve these problems, restore the kind of cooperation and good feelings that we had in China in the 1970s and 80s, and renew this sort of quasi-alliance that many people were talking about as little as a decade ago? Well, to answer that question, to examine the nature of the relationship this evening, what I propose to do is not talk about any of the specific issues. We can return to those in the question and answer period if you like, but rather talk about the structure of this relationship. What is it about the United States and China and their relationship to one another that has produced this perpetual, constant, shifting source of tension and conflict across a large number of issues? And I would argue that there are basically four things going on in the relationship, four kind of macro structural features of the relationship between the U.S. and China, which underlie the particular conflicts that you may read about in the paper or see on the television on any particular day. And the first of these structural features is the fact that the United States and China are both great empires. And by empires, I mean that both countries occupy a big piece of turf, measured in the millions of square miles, whole continents. We are not small countries, we're big countries. And we've got a lot of people. We both have populations that number in the hundreds of millions, and in China's case, over 1 billion. We also have big ideas about ourselves. Both of us like to strut our stuff. Both of us like to think of ourselves as really the center of the world, as really the source of values and ideals and the right way of doing things. And when you get two empires like that together, they tend to conflict. Now, why do they conflict? They conflict, first of all, because great empires project great interests abroad. We have economic interests in trade and investment and the application of international economic rules and regulations. And as we extend those economic interests beyond our borders, they inevitably bump up against the interests and aspirations of the other empire, and one gets sparks, one gets conflicts. As great empires, we also have wide-ranging security interests. We have areas that we consider our proper security zone, and beyond those we even have areas that we consider our proper sphere of influence. And as we both extend those security ambitions and interests beyond our borders, they bump up against one another and inevitably produce sparks and conflicts. We also have competing cultural interests. We have ideas that are bigger than ourselves. Ideas not only about how Americans on one side or Chinese on the other side ought to behave, what values they ought to cherish, but we have ideas about the nature of human beings themselves, what it means to be a human being, how human beings should relate, and we project those beyond our borders. And as a consequence, whether it's in the economic or strategic or cultural realms, great empires reach out beyond their borders and bump into one another. But that's only half of the picture. Because the other half of the picture is that great empires, while they have external interests, are ultimately anchored in domestic concerns. This is unlike small countries. Small countries, people who live in small countries are close to the border, no matter where they are. And when they're close to the border, they're inevitably reminded of their dependency on the outside world. Such is not true of great empires. Great empires, first of all, while they have external economic interests, their economy is ultimately dependent upon their domestic market. No matter how big the U.S. foreign trade is, it's never going to be more important to American businesses than the domestic market within the United States. That's the great anchor of our economy. That's the great market for our goods. That's the great source of our employees and our corporate strength. And the same is true of China. This is a huge continent that in the last analysis will speak in its economy to its domestic market, and that tends to pull the mentality of empires inward and give them a sense of their own importance and their own internal interests. The same is true of cultural values. I happen to have been born in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I can tell you that when you get out to Lincoln, Nebraska and look around, you have the rightful feeling that you're in the middle of the Middle Kingdom. Because everywhere you look, there are other Nebraskans and other Americans, and you're a long way from the edge of your empire. Your sense of your cultural medium, of your proper place in the world, falls within the boundaries of that huge continent. And the same thing is true of Chinese. If any of you have been in China, if you know when you get out into Hunan or Sichuan or Gansu province in the heartland of China and you look around, what you see is a lot of Chinese. And they think of themselves as the middle of their own world, and therefore their values, their ideals, their principles are largely shared by their neighbors and unchallenged by others, and seem to them right, just as we inside our empire think our values are right. Because the economy and the culture of empires ultimately pull people's sense of identity inward, so their political systems are largely run by domestic concerns. You know, I come from down the road a piece in Washington, and you may have noticed that we just had a sort of political revolution there in 1994. Well, the new generation of largely Republican congressmen that came into that town in 1994, many of them are quite proud of the fact that they don't know anything about anything outside America's borders. And they will tell you that with a certain amount of pride, underlying the fact that they're there because they represent the American people, they represent the constituency back home. That has a very powerful effect on America's mentality. It is that domestic constituency with its own culture, its own economic base, that ultimately drives our political system. And the same thing is true of China. It is ultimately a question of who controls the domestic political economy of the Chinese hinterland that will determine who stays on top in Beijing, not their relationship with the outside world. So this curious phenomenon of empires, that they are on the one hand dominated because of their size, because of their importance, they are ultimately dominated by the intellectual and economic and political forces within their own borders, and yet, but because they're empires, they also have interests that extend beyond the borders and conflict with other parties. They get into trouble. They tend to conflict with other parties, and when the conflict occurs, to think, I'm right and you're wrong. And I can tell you as an American, we're right and they're wrong, but I'll also tell you, because I know a lot of Chinese, they think they're right and we're wrong. And this structural feature of these two great empires is part of what is causing this ongoing conflict. And if you have any doubts about the truth of this proposition, I ask you only to consider the possibility that there were 1 billion Frenchmen occupying the whole of Europe, and imagine how we would get along with them. So, feature number one of this relationship, we are two empires, and empires have this domestic center of gravity and these external interests that conflict. Point number two about the U.S. and China, and this is not so much a spatial point as a temporal point, and that is we find ourselves at different points on the trajectory of history. And by that I mean that the United States is a much older country than China. Now that's an ironic statement, because we always think about China as the oldest continuous civilization and so forth and so on, and indeed it's true. But as a political system, we are the oldest in the world, and the Chinese are relative newcomers, having only founded their state in 1949, whereas we're, of course, over 200 years old. Now, so what? Well, it means that some of the fundamental features of our two systems are out of sync. Consider, for example, the question of territorial integrity, of territorial control. Americans have not always been happy with the size of America. We started out as 13 colonies, and we had this idea that we had a manifest destiny to occupy this whole continent, and indeed we did. And now it's over, and we've got everything that belongs to us, and the deal is done. It's settled. There is no piece of territory on earth that we think ought to be ours and is not yet incorporated into our state. We are a mature, complete territorial entity. Not so the Chinese. They haven't yet got all that they think belongs to them. Now, never mind what you think belongs to them or what I think belongs to them. They haven't finished the occupation of everything they think belongs to them. The most obvious examples, of course, are Hong Kong, which they will take over next July 1st, and Taiwan, which they may or may not take over. There's some difference of opinion on that, but from their point of view, that is part of their eventual manifest destiny. But it's not only Hong Kong and Taiwan. China has no settled borders with most of its neighbors. They have no border treaty with Vietnam and very deep disputes over where the line should be drawn. They have no border treaty with India and serious disputes over where the line should be drawn. They have no border treaty with Russia and serious disputes on that front. So from their point of view, they're not done yet. Their territorial integrity is not yet fulfilled. Ours is, and that gives us very different ideas about what constitutes proper international behavior. We think the deal is over, everybody should sit still and be happy, because that's what we've got, and that would be the best for us. It would quiet the world down. They think they're still on a process of occupation, and their rightful place has not yet been achieved. Or consider the international legal structure, the rules of the game which we all play by. Now, it's often the case that Americans think of the international system as somehow delivered by God, that there was this event that established the principles of national sovereignty, the very existence of a state. and the notion that it should have something called sovereignty or right to control over its own affairs, that it should send out people to represent them to other states and call those people ambassadors and expect that those people should have special rights in representing their states, or that they should pass pieces of paper back and forth and sign them and call them treaties and make them deals between states. All of those things which we've grown up with and think of as normal were in fact invented in Europe and spread around the world in the 19th and 20th century through the process of imperialism and implanted as the international order. Secondly, the particular features of the way that system has worked in the post-war world has been invented largely by us in the form of international political units like the United Nations, the international economic structures, the IMF and the World Bank, the international security arrangements such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Missile Control Regime, the treaties on chemical and biological weapons. All of that structure of international law, the particular deals that have been worked out, are largely of our invention, and we like them. We should like them. We wrote them. We participated in the creation of this international legal structure. Well, the Chinese are coming along a little bit later, and they're looking at all of this stuff and saying, I don't think I like that very much. And we're saying, well, but no, here, the cards are dealt. Deal the hand that's played you. And the Chinese are saying, wait a minute. We didn't shuffle the deck. We didn't check to see if there are 4 jacks in there. We didn't cut the deck before it was dealt. We're not going to play this game. We want to re-examine the whole structure of the international legal and political order that you're saying is a done deal, and we're saying as new participants, we'd like to reconsider. And so we're at different points in our participation in international affairs and in our sense of what the international system is and ought to be. And for us, like the territorial question, the international legal order is a done deal. It's there, it's set, we like it, we want the rules to be honored. And the Chinese aren't at the same place in their historical development and don't accept those propositions at face value. Or, finally, consider the nature of our political system. If I were to ask you, what is the purpose of the American government? You would probably scratch your head, because in a certain sense, our system of government has no purpose other than to be available to be seized by whatever political organization comes along and can muster enough votes and representatives to take charge of the machinery. And that's what we think politics ought to be. It ought to be an empty shell that is seized by domestic political interests for whatever they think it ought to do. In the 1960s and 70s, the coalition came along and said, we got to push this whole thing toward civil rights, toward an expanded role of the state in the welfare system, and so forth and so on. And now in the 1990s, a new set of political interests are coming along, and they're saying, no, we got to push the whole system in the other direction. We've got to re-examine affirmative action. We've got to re-examine the welfare state. We've got to look at all of these budgetary implications of these things. But the political system was there for either group to seize control of. If you ask a Chinese, what is their government for? The answer is, it's there to lead China from its present unsatisfactory state toward an ideal future. If our political system is instrumental in the sense that it is a machinery waiting to be grabbed by whatever political interest can take control of it, their political system is ideological in the sense of having a mission and a purpose to transform society and to take it along that historical trajectory from its present unsatisfactory, backward, and disadvantaged place on the curve to where China really belongs, which is at the head of the parade. And so their notion of their territorial integrity, of the international legal system, of the nature of politics and what government is for, in all of those ways are fundamentally different from ours. And it's because largely that they are not at the same place historically that we are. We are a more mature country with more settled interest and more to defend, if you will. So that's point two. Not only are we two great empires that naturally conflict because of the structure of our spatial distribution and our economic and cultural commitments, but we're temporally in a different place. We are at a different point on the trajectory, and that also contributes to our conflicts. But that's not all. There's a third feature of this relationship, and that has to do with the context in which we find ourselves, and particularly with the end of the Cold War. You may recall that in the 1970s and 80s, the United States and China got on remarkably well. Now, it wasn't because we had no differences of opinion on the questions of human rights or how the state ought to treat its people. It was not because our economic interests coincided or that we had any more deeper understanding or benevolent feelings toward one another. It was for one simple reason, and that was neither of us liked the Soviet Union. And both of us thought that we could play the other against the Soviet Union to enhance our own security and interests in the Cold War world. We called it playing the China card. But the leaders in China, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and the architects of the rapprochement of the early 1970s, in their mind, they were playing the American card. And both parties saw in one another a partner in a triangular relationship that served their common security interests vis-a-vis that third pole. Now that third pole has collapsed. That security and strategic rationale for the maintenance of a good U.S.-China relationship has been removed. And with the removal of that justification, we are left to face one another naked and without a trump card and without an alternative and without a reason for being friends. And as a consequence, what we have seen, particularly during the late Bush and Clinton administrations, is we have seen a disintegration of U.S.-China relationships, in which the central controlling force behind the relationship, on our side, the president, is unable to coordinate the various issues in the relationship by playing the trump card of national security, by saying we're going to adjust these and this issue and human rights and trade and arms sales and the like, and we're going to make this and that deal because we have an overriding common interest in opposition to the Soviet Union. When that justification is removed, what happens is, and what has happened in the U.S.-China relationship, is that each of these issue areas, human rights, economics, security, arms sales, nuclear proliferation, and regional security, Taiwan, each of them develops a life of its own. It has its own constituents, its own interest groups, its own bureaucracies, its own elements of the U.S. government, its own allies in Congress, and each of those issue areas tends to drive its own agenda in the relationship. And in the absence of the overriding argument that we need China to play against the Soviet Union, the president is much weakened in his ability to coordinate and pull together those loose interests on behalf of an overriding relationship with China. And the same thing is going on in China. They are equally unable to coordinate their own domestic interests in the security field, where a lot of the crackdown on dissidents is occurring and the human rights violations are occurring. In the economic sphere, where, for example, they're trying to close down the manufacturers of software that are violating intellectual property rights. In the military, which has a particular interest in foreign arms sales because they get a lot of the profits and can use them to buy their own weapons and the like. And their central administration, like ours, has a difficult time pulling together those various interests in the absence of an overriding strategic argument. So the third feature I would point to here is life in the post-Cold War world. The difficulty, and Frank and I were talking about this earlier in the evening, the difficulty of intellectually conceptualizing the nature of international politics in the post-Cold War world, not only to use it to make decisions, but equally important to use it as a basis for argument within your own political system to mobilize interests on behalf of overriding concerns. So we're seeing the relationship, I think, disintegrate in part because of the end of the Cold War. And finally, the fourth feature I would point to in this relationship is what I would call something like faddism. Americans, you know, have a curious relationship with China. On the one hand, not only Americans, but Western Europeans and Westerners for the last several hundred years think of China as a pretty big deal. And it is a pretty big deal. It's the biggest deal ever invented by human beings outside control of and contact with the West. It's the other game that happened on the other side of the Himalayas in all of its fundamentals, in the invention of language and writing and social organization and political states and artistic styles and philosophical ideals. It's the answer to the question of where but for the grace of God might I be? And the answer is you might be a Chinese. You might have a fundamentally different way of organizing your society, and that has made China always very attractive to Western men and women. But the other side of the coin is, truth is, we know as a society almost nothing at all about those guys. We see them at a great distance with very little information. And as a consequence, we have to generalize about them on the basis of very limited knowledge, with the consequence that our image of China easily flip-flops. It easily goes from very positive to very negative, from very optimistic to very pessimistic, from very benevolent to very malevolent. And this has occurred just in our own lifetimes. I mean, you, I'm sure, remember with me the 1950s and 60s when China was the red menace and it was going to overrun Vietnam, and then somehow they were all, I'm not sure what the deal was, but they were somehow going to get on junks and come over and get us because there was going to be this spread of Asian communism that was just going to take over the world. We had to fight it. Well, in the 1970s and 80s, somehow all that changed. And China was all of a sudden this benevolent regime that was taking care of its people, that was going to be our ally and friend, that was going to have shows of their products at Macy's, and everyone was going to run down and buy something Chinese. And there was this kind of tremendous outpouring of positive feeling toward China. Well, in the 1990s, as we just reviewed, somehow that's all flipped back over, and everything the Chinese do seems to tick somebody on the Washington Post editorial staff off because you're sure they're going to get an article the next day on that particular problem in China. The exact same thing is going on in China. The Chinese, if we think the Chinese are important, they think we're a lot more important to them than they are to us. And it's true. We are a lot more important to them than they are to us. But they know almost nothing at all about us. And as a consequence, their visions of America also flip-flop very easily. We're both caught in this relationship in which we, in a sense, overestimate one another, overgeneralize about one another, and get caught up in a kind of reinforcing faddism in our views of one another, so that our images of China change much more than the reality changes. I don't know how much you might know, but let me tell you, and we can take this up in the discussion session if you like, the human rights situation in China is light years better in the 1990s, when we have a very negative view of China's human rights record, than it was in the 1970s, when we had a very benevolent view of China. The reality has gotten infinitely better, and the view has gotten infinitely worse. And so there is something to the lens through which we view one another that tends to reinforce these conflicts and integrate them into mutually negative images that create this kind of downward spiral. Well, these are some of the major features, I think, at work in the relationship. We've got two great empires here, driven by internal concerns, internal values and perceptions and economic markets and political orders, in which the real strength of the empire is domestic, but it extends far beyond its borders and bumps up against the other empire. We found ourselves at different points on our historical trajectories, and as a consequence have very different views about what constitutes proper territorial rights, international legal systems, the role of political leadership and its purposes in the world. We are living in a post-Cold War world in which we're brought up nose to nose with the Chinese, with no outside factor to override the sources of our immediate conflicts. And as a consequence, not only are those conflicts more prominent, but they tend to disintegrate the political policy-making structure within each country and make it more difficult for central leadership to manage the relationship. And finally, as a people, we both tend to see one another in faddish and reinforcing ways that can be very, very good or can be very, very bad, and right now they're very, very bad. Well, where's all this going to take us? Where are we going? Are these factors, are these structural factors going to lead to a continuing exacerbation in the relationship, one that might very well lead toward open confrontation and even military conflict, as seemed so possible during the worst of the recent Taiwan Straits crisis? Or are we somehow going to reorder this relationship and put it back together again? Well, the first thing you want to do when any China scholar tells you what's going to happen in the future is keep a firm hand on your wallet, because the truth of the matter is no China watcher has any idea what's going to happen in China. They've all been wrong consistently, and I'm certainly one of them. But let me close here, and because I do want to hear your questions and comments, but let me close here by putting out at least a set of propositions for how the U.S., how we should view the relationship and what we should do about it. My view is that what we've got with China right now is a normal relationship, and we ought to learn to live with it. This is not going to be a partnership. It's not going to be an alliance. It's going to be a very difficult relationship. What we've got here, a daily kind of grind of differences of opinion across a large range of issues, is what is likely to be characteristic of the relationship for a long time to come. And frankly, that's pretty good news. That's a pretty good relationship for us, because what we really don't want from the Chinese is either at the one end of the spectrum that China should become very powerful and very hostile to the United States, nor at the other end of the spectrum, something that would be even worse, is that China gets not very powerful, but that it collapses, and by its own internal disorder creates problems for itself and all of its neighbors. We should be happier to see the maintenance of a kind of ongoing low boil of differences. And how can we do that? Well, in my view, we can do it in three ways. First of all, we can draw lines beyond which we will not accept a deterioration of the relationship. And in my opinion, the recent Taiwan Straits crisis, in which the Chinese launched missiles in the Taiwan Straits and we sent two battle carriers, two aircraft carriers and a support group, that was a very good thing, in my opinion. It tended to reinforce the understanding on both sides and among all parties in the region that there are certain limits to which we will not accept a deterioration, and one of those limits is the use of force in the Taiwan Straits. And it is very important that we make the Chinese clearly understand where those limits are, and equally important, that we understand where the limits are, that we know what it is we're going to fight for and not going to fight for. And so, from my point of view, it's very healthy that that relationship was clarified, and I think it can have a very positive effect on the future of relations in that area. At the other end of the spectrum, I think we've got to keep in mind that we have enormous overriding common interests with the Chinese. We ought not be overwhelmed by the daily news about these various conflicts in trade and human rights and the like. We have an unusually long run of peace and prosperity in East Asia. The good news is you probably haven't had very many speakers on China recently. And the reason probably is that the action is all somewhere else. The action is in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. And the reasons are quite simple. Asia's period of decolonization is over. It's a period in which the colonial powers withdrew from the region, and there was a sorting out process in which the parties in the region kind of figured out who was going to govern what and so forth and so on. And that's basically over in East Asia, and the conclusion of that period of decolonization has given rise to an enormous burst of economic development, which has established essential peace and prosperity in the region, and we have enormous interest in maintaining that. Parenthetically, notice that the process of decolonization in the former Soviet Union, that is to say the removal of the Soviet Empire, has given rise to the very type of scramble for political order that was so characteristic of East Asia in the 1950s and 60s, and that's why all the attention on the front page of the paper is over there. Well, there's good news in Asia. It's peace, it's prosperity, people are doing better. We want to maintain that. How can we maintain that with the Chinese? One important way is to promote the areas of collaboration and mutual interest that we have with the Chinese. And therefore, I was very much buoyed by Clinton's recent visit to Korea and the announcement of a proposal for a four-party talk for the resolution of the conflict in the Korean Peninsula, in which North and South Korea would be joined by China and the United States. That's exactly the kind of place in which the United States and China can cooperate for the resolution of conflict, and we ought to look for such opportunities and promote them. Finally, between the lines below which we will not allow this relationship to decline and the heights to which we would like to promote its ascension lies a very wide band of potential conflict. And in that area, my sense is that we ought to view it like raising a teenager. You know, I have a teenager at home, maybe some of you do. You know that when you have a teenager, every day is a new battle. You never really win. You kind of fight to a stalemate, and then the next morning the issue changes and the tension starts again. Well, that's the kind of relationship we're going to have with China. We're not going to agree with them on human rights or on trade or on arms sales or on any of these issues that divide us. But what we want to do is maintain the relationship within the bounds of that ongoing negotiation, which is better than the alternatives. Well, I'm sorry to have talked so long because I know that with such a large and apparently attentive audience that you must have some things to say or questions to ask, so let me stop there.
I was interested in the reference to Chinese grasslands, and I wondered if you'd tell us a little bit about them and any environmental or international implications they may have. Yes.
The question was really about the Chinese grasslands. I have been involved for the last 5 years in an international project that includes natural and social scientists from China, the United States, and Mongolia to examine the long-term ecological changes on the Mongolian steppe, which is the northern tier of China's grasslands. And it's very different from the China that you usually see of rice paddies and so forth. It's more like Wyoming and Colorado, a kind of prairie country, and is the fuel source of Genghis Khan's armies when they conquered the world. It is the home of the nomadic populations of Central Asia, of whom the Mongols are the most prominent group. I am particularly interested in, and my part of the study focuses on the boundary zone between agriculture and animal husbandry, the edge at which agriculture has been extended north and west into the prairie. And the situation there is a total disaster. It is a, you know, if any of you have been out west, you can still see portions of the American prairie that were plowed up in the 1890s and planted to red wheat, and they still haven't recovered. Well, because of the population pressure and the expansion of the Chinese or Han people to the north and west, a whole band, hundreds of kilometers wide, of what was once stable grassland has been largely destroyed, and as a consequence, the forces of Central Asian winds have unleashed those sands across the north. So it is a problem of major national, for China national, but also international environmental consequences, and that's part of what I've been looking at. Yes, sir.
Okay. China has a number of immediate neighbors who are themselves very significant in the world and who also are dynamically changing, one might say, turbulent societies. I would be curious if you could, be interested in your opinion about China's present state of relationship with India, with Russia, with the Asiatic former Soviet republics, and with Indochina.
Mm-hmm. The question is really about China's relationship with its immediate neighbors, primarily Russia, India, and Vietnam, or the primary power in Indochina. I guess, first of all, I'd say two things. The first thing is that over time, if you look at the big picture in the last century to 2 centuries, the one thing you can say is China doesn't get along with its neighbors. There is something about this political system that makes it inherently and fundamentally difficult to deal with. And so what we have seen, whether it was the communists or the nationalists or the Qing dynasty before them, what we have seen out of China is a repetition of failed partnerships with the Russians, with the Vietnamese, and so forth and so on. So the first thing you'd want to say about the Chinese is they don't get along very well. Now, having said that, in the immediate Deng Xiaoping era, that is to say the reform era, the Chinese are getting along much better with all of their neighbors. As you know, Yeltsin has just visited. There is a renewed modus vivendi with the Russians based on mutual economic interests, largely the Chinese shipping consumer goods to an impoverished Russia that wants good consumer goods, and the Chinese buying a lot of weaponry, including heavy-duty stuff left over from the Russian arsenal. There is a decided improvement in Russian-Vietnamese relations. Again, this has been a very difficult relationship, which led to an out-and-out shooting war in 1979. But much more of a modus vivendi now. The Vietnamese have pulled out of Cambodia. The Chinese have reached a modus vivendi on the border. That's better. Again, with India, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the removal of India's primary external partner, the Chinese have and the Indians have been back at least a kind of low-level discussion, which has greatly relaxed tensions on that border. So I would say, big picture, long-term conflict with their immediate border partners, but in the immediate past decade, much better relations.
I want to thank you for a very informative and enlightening appraisal of the relationship this evening. We know that China is going to take over Hong Kong before too long, and as an investment manager, I'm concerned about businesses in Hong Kong. And my question is, in your view, how will China treat Hong Kong? Will it allow the free market to flourish, or should people in Hong Kong begin leaving now?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I wouldn't bank my investments on the answer I'm about to give you, but I have thought about the question somewhat, and I will tell you what I think. I guess I would say two things. Viewed narrowly within the economic sphere, the problem is not will the Chinese be able to deal with the private sector. half of China's privatized. I mean, private enterprise has come to China, both domestic privatization of the economy as well as foreign investment. They do incorporate private enterprise. The problem is, can they do it in a way that doesn't destroy the strength of the Hong Kong economy, which has been based on the rule of law? A pound is a pound and a deal is a deal. Well, in China, a pound is not a pound and a deal is not a deal. It is an economic system still heavily influenced by political intervention in all areas of commerce. And it is beyond my imagination that Hong Kong will not suffer from that integration into that politically influenced economy. So will they absorb Hong Kong's private economic sector? Yes, I think they will. But it will become to look more like the political/economic system of mainland China, which is decidedly different from what we've known in Hong Kong. Second question, and this is really a question for you, and that is, what will the private financial markets do when the crackdown comes in the symbolic area? And by that I mean publishing, freedom of speech, political organization, not economic zone areas where I think the Chinese will seek accommodation, but the political and human rights zone where they will not seek accommodation. Because I cannot imagine a regime in Peking that is going to allow the kind of disruptive political expressions that Hong Kong people have come to take for granted. And when the crackdown comes in that area, what will be the spillover on the economy? That's the issue.
In light of the 4 areas of conflict that you mentioned, do you think, number one, it's a good idea to continue with most favored nation status? And also from the ecological standpoint, what are your perceptions of the new gigantic dam that has been proposed over there?
Yeah. Yes, 2 questions, one on the renewal of MFN and the other on the Three Gorges Dam, which is being built on the central Yangtze. On the MFN question, in the context of the things I just said, I think renewal of N should be automatic. And the reason is that it's a blunt instrument. It is too massive a response, and it doesn't give you the ability to engage the Chinese in a sophisticated way across a large number of issues. My image for U.S.-China relations is that it should be managed in a sophisticated way, and MFN doesn't allow you to do that. It simply across the board says no special tariff treatment. So I'm in favor of renewal of MFN for the reasons I gave. On the Three Gorges Dam, you may have noticed in the past week the U.S. Import-Export Bank did not provide concessionary funding for the sale of U.S. goods to China for that project. I'm very much in favor of that. I think the Three Gorges Dam project is an environmental disaster. I think the Chinese knew that, and that's the reason that the dam, which was first proposed in 1919, was consistently rejected until 1989 on its merits. And the reason the decision was made to build the dam after 1989, I believe, was a political decision by a leadership in the post-Tiananmen environment that wanted to prove that they could still do big things and create the biggest project in the history of the world next to the Great Wall of China. And therefore have driven it through for political reasons, but not for reasons that are justified even by China's own scientists. So, yes, the question was about the overseas Chinese, particularly those in East Asia, and this is primarily Southeast Asia, playing an enormously important role in the economic expansion of Southeast Asia. I just returned from a trip to Southeast Asia, and everywhere you went, it was clear that the economic miracle of that region was being driven by the Chinese who live in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the like, and not by the native populations of the region. So overseas Chinese, enormously influential in that area, and increasingly wanting to strike a deal with big China. Very upset about the United States, very critical of us for being provocative, pugnacious, looking for ways to criticize China, and basically they're advising us to shut up, keep it quiet, work with the Chinese, and keep the peace. So I would say increasingly a division in the purposes and practices of the United States and this very influential overseas Chinese community. I guess we have time for one more question. We have one more gentleman.
Do you think the recent maneuvers in the Taiwan Strait were as much to impress mainland China as they were to impress Taiwan?
I think that is really a very good question. My view is this, that everybody who's party to the region, and I'm sorry, the question was the Taiwan Straits exercise was this, and I think by this I think you meant the launching of missiles from the PRC into the waters of the Taiwan Straits. Was that exercise for the consumption of people in China, on mainland China, as much as on Taiwan or more than on Taiwan? And my short answer is yes, and the reason is this. I think all of the major actors in the region, and by this I mean not only the countries, the peoples, but more important, the incumbent elites, the rulers of Taiwan, China, Japan, Korea, the United States, and others, they all know the same dirty little secret. And the dirty little secret is peace, prosperity, and economic growth are good for me. And that's what I, as a political leader, want. And I think that all of them know that. Now, there's another side to this, and the reason it's a dirty little secret is they can't say it. And the reason they can't say it is that they have domestic constituencies that place a very high value on national pride. And what happened, I think, in the Taiwan Straits crisis is that a dynamic was started in Taiwan in which Lee Teng-hui, who was up for election as the first elected president of Taiwan, had a very strong, independent, assertive domestic constituency whose votes he wanted. And in order to get their votes, he played a very bullish role in international affairs, coming to the United States, getting a degree from Cornell, traveling around the world, and in that process triggered the people on the mainland to have to make a response for their own domestic political concerns, to show people at home that indeed they are in control of the Middle Empire and they're not going to let this little twerp on the island run around and thumb his nose at the PRC. And so that their prompting to action in this case was largely a demonstration to their own domestic political environment, particularly their own military, that they were in fact in control of events. So I think that in a way, the dynamic of the situation was more internally driven, first in Taiwan and then in the PRC, than it was what you might call a classic foreign conflict.
Little needs to be said for an evening that was totally well spent. We're in your debt for a tour de force. It was educational and thoroughly enjoyable. It's been a great evening. We thank you.